The days following Barron's visit to the small town passed by in a blur. His mind was clouded with the stories James had shared, the raw emotion in his voice, the pain in his eyes. It felt as though those stories had seeped into his very being, leaving him restless and uncertain. Barron had grown up hearing tales of heroism and duty, but those stories had always seemed distant, abstract, a part of history, not his reality. But now, sitting with James, he had felt something shift within him. The idea of sacrifice, of honor, of redemption. These weren't just words. They were real, living things, and they held weight. Barron couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to help. He didn't know how, but he couldn't ignore the pull in his chest, urging him to do something, to make a difference. James's story had broken through the surface of his privilege, challenging him to look beyond the shiny exterior of his life, to the raw, unspoken truth of the world around him. He couldn't let this man's life slip back into obscurity. He couldn't let James's sacrifice be forgotten. But how could he, someone with no real understanding of hardship, make an impact? As days turned into weeks, Barron spent every free moment researching veterans like James. He read about the challenges they faced when they returned home, how the system that once promised them care and respect had betrayed them. The country's promises seemed to fade the moment the uniforms came off. Barron learned of the struggles many veterans faced with mental health issues, homelessness, and the deep, often invisible wounds that lingered long after the battle ended. Each story he uncovered deepened his resolve. He wasn't just dealing with one forgotten veteran. He was staring at a much larger issue, one that stretched across the nation and time. He reached out to veterans organizations, hoping to find a way to help, but the bureaucratic walls he encountered only seemed to make the problem more daunting. The deeper he dug, the more disillusioned he became. What could he, a young man with no experience in these matters, possibly do to change anything? Yet, even in his frustration, Barron couldn't stop thinking about James. He remembered the pain in the old man's eyes when he spoke of the years he spent in isolation, watching the world move on without him. Barron understood now. He wasn't just witnessing a personal tragedy. He was seeing the result of a broken system. James wasn't just a forgotten veteran. He was a casualty of a society that had long ago abandoned the very people who had given their all. Barron began to understand the depth of the battle that James and so many others faced. It wasn't just about being remembered. It was about being seen, about having a voice in a world that often preferred to look the other way. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He had been born into a world of privilege, where problems could be solved with power or money. But here, in this world of forgotten soldiers and abandoned promises, there were no quick fixes. Days turned into weeks, and the cold winter months began to edge toward spring. Barron's thoughts returned to James, who he hadn't seen in several weeks. The old man had stopped showing up at the diner, and Barron found himself feeling anxious, unsure of where to look for him. He couldn't shake the worry that perhaps he had lost his chance to make a difference in James's life, or worse, that the veteran had slipped away into the shadows once more, never to be heard from again. One evening, Barron drove back to the small town, a sense of urgency in his chest. He couldn't just leave things unfinished. James's story wasn't just his. It was a story of countless others who had fought and returned home, only to be discarded by the very country they had risked everything for. Barron knew he needed to do something more than research and talk. He needed to act. When he arrived at the diner, the place was almost empty. The rain had started again, and the air smelled of earth and wet pavement. Barron stood at the counter, scanning the room, but there was no sign of James. His heart sank. Had he come all this way for nothing? Just as Barron turned to leave, a familiar voice called out from the back of the diner. "You looking for someone?" Barron turned quickly, his heart skipping a beat when he saw James standing there, leaning on the doorframe, his face haggard but alive with the same intensity Barron had seen weeks before. "James," Barron said, his voice tinged with both relief and guilt. "I've been looking for you. I didn't know if you were okay." James studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I've been getting by," he said, his voice heavy with the unspoken truths. "But not all of us are getting by." "What's your story?" Barron asked after a long silence, his voice soft but genuine. The question hung in the air for a long moment before James spoke. "My story? It's one you won't find in the history books. It's not a tale of glory or triumph. It's one of loss, of sacrifice, and I suppose of being forgotten." His voice broke slightly on the last word, and Barron could see the weight of his years, of the things he'd seen, settling heavily on his shoulders. James began to tell Barron his story, not in grand, sweeping statements, but in quiet, fragmented memories that seemed to linger in the air long after he spoke them. He told Barron about his time in the service, the battles he had fought, and the brothers he had lost. He spoke of a nation that had once revered its veterans, only to turn its back on them when the wars were over. He shared stories of family, of dreams, and of the slow unraveling of his life as he struggled to find a place in a world that no longer seemed to understand him. Barron listened, captivated by the raw emotion in James's words. He had never heard such a story, not from his family, not from anyone. His life had been one of privilege and public attention, yet here, in this small diner with this forgotten veteran, Barron felt a connection he had never experienced before. It was as though, in James's pain, Barron saw a reflection of his own unspoken struggles, his own search for meaning in a world that often seemed to expect more from him than he could give. As the conversation stretched into the afternoon, Barron began to understand something he had never fully grasped before: the true cost of honor, the weight of duty, and the heavy burden of a past that could never be erased. He realized that redemption wasn't something that could be easily found, nor was it something that could be given by others. It was something that had to be earned, something that had to be lived. The rain had stopped by the time Barron stood to leave, his mind racing with the stories James had shared. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he walked into the diner that morning, but he knew one thing for certain. He had found something here that was far more valuable than anything his name or family could ever offer. He had found a story of true honor, a story of sacrifice and redemption that would change him in ways he could never have imagined. As Barron stepped out into the cold, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had learned, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to uncover, so many untold stories waiting to be heard. But the one thing Barron knew was this: redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey, and this was only the first step. What Barron didn't know, as he walked away from that small town, was that the story of James Andrews wasn't just about a forgotten veteran. It was about a young man learning the true meaning of honor and the ways in which the past never truly stays buried. The next chapter in their journey together had only just begun. And as Barron drove back toward his life, toward the world he thought he knew, one thought echoed in his mind. Could he ever find redemption for himself, just as James had fought for his own? The rain began to pour as Barron Trump sat on the steps of an old weathered house, his thoughts distant and his gaze even farther away. He had always been in the spotlight, a public figure born into a family that had seen more than its fair share of controversy and attention. But today, there was no media buzz, no flashing cameras, just the sound of raindrops hitting the ground and the wind howling through the trees. Barron wasn't thinking about the usual whirlwind of his life. He wasn't thinking about his name, his fame, or even his family. Today, he was reflecting on something deeper, something far more personal, honor, and redemption. His journey had taken an unexpected turn. Barron, known to many as the son of the 45th president, had always lived under the weight of expectation. From a young age, he was thrust into the limelight, his every move scrutinized and analyzed by millions. But as the years passed, Barron found himself yearning for something more than the public's gaze. He wanted to find his own path, something that would define him beyond his family name. Little did he know that this search for purpose would lead him to a forgotten veteran, a man whose past was a silent testament to sacrifice and bravery. The veteran, once a proud soldier, now lived in a small town far from the bustling streets of Washington, D.C. His name was James Andrews, and his life had been marked by both valor and tragedy. Once a young man eager to serve his country, James had seen things in battle that no one should ever have to endure. His mind had been scared by the horrors of war, and his heart broken by the loss of friends who never made it back. Over the years, as time passed and the world around him moved on, James had become a forgotten hero, a man lost to history, his name fading into obscurity. The country had moved on, but James had not. The two would meet by fate, their paths crossing in a way that neither could have anticipated. Barron, now a young adult, was on a mission to rediscover his own sense of purpose. James, an old man with a world of pain in his eyes, was clinging to his past, unable to move forward. The unlikely connection between the two would spark something far more profound than either could have imagined. A bond forged through shared moments of vulnerability, honor, and healing. Their first meeting took place on a cold winter morning when Barron, tired of the routine of his daily life, decided to take a drive to clear his mind. He found himself in the small town where James lived, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He wandered into the local diner, seeking warmth and a moment of respite from his thoughts. James was sitting alone in the corner, his weathered face lined with years of experience and pain. His uniform, now a faded memory of his youth, hung loosely on his shoulders, a quiet reminder of a life that had been lived with purpose. It was Barron who approached first, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because something about James seemed familiar. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes scanning Barron with a mixture of caution and recognition. There was something about Barron that reminded him of his own younger self, a time when he had been filled with dreams of serving his country, of making a difference in the world. James had never been one to share his story, but something in Barron's demeanor made him want to talk. "Can I help you, son?" James's voice was rough, as though years of silence had made it gravelly. Barron hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach the stranger sitting before him. "I'm not sure," Barron said quietly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "I guess I'm just trying to figure things out." James studied him for a moment longer before nodding slightly. He knew that feeling all too well. "A lot of people come here looking for answers," he said, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the snow was beginning to fall. "Most of them leave without finding anything." Barron wasn't sure why, but he found himself sitting down across from the old man. For some reason, he didn't feel the need to explain himself. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared recognition of the loneliness that seemed to hang in the air. In a small, cluttered studio on the outskirts of the city, an artist sat hunched over his canvas, brush in hand, staring at the half-finished masterpiece before him. The room was filled with the scent of oil paints and the quiet hum of a city far removed from the solitude within these walls. For years, this studio had been his sanctuary, a place where his dreams, frustrations, and hopes collided in vibrant strokes of color. But today was different. Today, something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change the course of his life forever. This artist wasn't your typical success story. He wasn't the kind of person who had gotten the big break right out of art school. Instead, he was the kind of person whose passion and dedication to his craft were evident, yet whose work had not yet found its place in the world. His name was Jack Carter, a man with a fire for painting, but a bank account that barely matched his ambition. Most days, the only thing that kept him going was the belief that one day his art would be discovered, that one day the world would see what he had to offer. But as months passed and his savings dwindled, that hope was beginning to fade. The rent was overdue, and Jack had to decide whether he would give up on his dream or keep pushing forward, even if it meant living in constant uncertainty. Despite all of his struggles, Jack's art was always his one escape from the harsh reality outside. It was his connection to a world of possibility, a world where he could bring his deepest emotions to life through every brushstroke. On this particular morning, Jack found himself in the familiar haze of self-doubt. He was staring at a piece he had been working on for weeks, a portrait that captured the raw emotion of loss. But it wasn't coming together as he had hoped. He stood back, running a hand through his messy hair, and sighed. It wasn't just the painting that felt off, it was everything. The bills were piling up, the offers for exhibitions were non-existent, and his friends had long stopped asking how his work was going. Maybe it's time to face the reality, Jack muttered to himself, wiping his face with his sleeve. Maybe I'm just not good enough. He reached for the paint thinner, ready to abandon the piece and start again. But just as he was about to dip the rag, a soft knock echoed through the door. Startled, Jack quickly wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door, half expecting it to be a delivery driver or one of the neighbors. But when the door swung open, he froze. Standing there, in the middle of his modest, somewhat disorganized studio, was a man he never in a million years expected to see, Elon Musk. Jack blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him. What are you doing here?" he stammered, trying to comprehend the surreal scene unfolding in front of him. Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur, the innovator behind SpaceX, Tesla, and so much more, was standing in his humble art studio, looking every bit as out of place as Jack felt in his own home. Elon smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with warmth. "I've been following your work for a while," he said, his voice calm and measured, yet with an unmistakable hint of curiosity. "There's something about your art. It speaks to me." Jack's mind raced, disbelief flooding his thoughts. "You've been following my work?" he asked, still trying to wrap his head around the idea. "But I'm just some artist struggling to make ends meet." Elon's eyes softened, a glimmer of understanding crossing his face. "I know what it's like to struggle," he said. "To push forward when everyone tells you that it's not going to work. I've been there myself." Jack didn't know how to respond. The man standing before him was a billionaire, someone who had changed the world with his ideas. And yet, here he was, acknowledging Jack's work in a way that made it seem as though all of Jack's struggles had led to this very moment. The thought was overwhelming. But what came next was even more mind-boggling. Elon took a few steps into the studio, his eyes scanning the paintings that lined the walls. "I want to help you," he said, his tone serious. "You're an incredible artist, Jack, but you're stuck in a cycle that's preventing your art from reaching its full potential. I have an idea that might change everything." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? How can you help?" "I'm going to offer you something no one else can," Elon replied. "But first, I need you to trust me."